Imagine living in a world divided into two powerful camps where every decision, from the economy to space exploration, was shaped by an intense rivalry. This was the Cold War, and the effects are still felt today. This is Wendy with AP History Help, and this is the AP History Help podcast, where you will learn everything you need to know to conquer the AP History exam, whether you're taking AP World History or AP US History, from skills to content, from historical thinking skills to themes in history. Hello to my listeners, my viewers, my students, my colleagues even. I am so grateful that you take 20 to 25 minutes of your day to listen to my podcast. You have choices, and the fact that you've chosen AP History Help, it just means the world to me. I've evolved from the first episodes, not just in that season 1 was skills and season 2 is content, but in trying to make it a better show with each episode that I prepare. So whether you listen on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any one of the countless other platforms, or watch my videos on YouTube, sincerely, thank you. One of the things that I've done for the last few episodes is record video from two angles. I don't know whether it makes a difference to you, but I feel like it elevates the podcast ever so slightly to the next step. I'd love your feedback. Comment on a video on YouTube, or you can also comment on an episode on Spotify. I promise I'll respond, even if just to say thank you. Also, did you know, I announced this in the last episode, but I'm giving away a free copy of my Student Success Planner at the end of March. There is a bit.ly link that is being shown on my screen. It is also in the show notes, super easy to find. It is bit.ly, which is bit.ly /APHH planner. All you got to do is go in there, fill in your name, your email address, how you listen to the podcast. There's like 4 questions. Submit it, and I will pick one lucky winner that will receive a free, no obligation, no questions asked planner from me, just in time to really help you get prepared for that AP exam. Okay, on to today's episode. Unit 8. We're getting close to the end, you guys. Unit 8, whether AP World or APUSH, is mostly Cold War. Both courses have a good deal of overlap at this point in time, and today is from the perspective of AP World History. The time period covers 45 years, from 1945 to 1991. I know, I hear you doing the math. It's 46. I like these nice round numbers. Anyway, the big picture themes cover Cold War conflicts, ideological battles, proxy wars, decolonization, global resistance, and the fall of the Soviet Union. While we cover all of the historical thinking skills, causation, continuity and change, and comparison. So let's begin by setting the stage. A little bit of context here. After World War II, the US and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers with competing ideologies. Capitalism versus communism. There were a few key conferences that did that. Tehran Conference in 1943 was the first meeting of the Big Three, that being the meeting of the leaders of Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Keep in mind that the Normandy invasion hadn't even happened yet. So they met to discuss the post-war world. While the ideological differences began to emerge, the next conference was at Yalta in the spring of 1945. Now, it's important to point out, as you should remember from Unit 7, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, was not the easiest person in the world to get along with. He was quite paranoid. And the US president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, he knew how to interact with him, to massage his ego so that Stalin wouldn't go off onto some tizzy. Regardless, we start to see some cracks in the Allies having a unified front. It was clear that Stalin wanted to put a pro-Soviet government in place in Poland, despite the previous government waiting in Britain to take back control. So he, that being Stalin, he conceded slightly and promised that once things got settled, he'd allow elections to take place. Well, spoiler alert, those elections never happened. It was here that they also discussed dividing Germany into 4 zones of occupation once the war was over. And finally, the meeting at Potsdam took place in July of 1945. The war in Europe had ended, Franklin Roosevelt had died and was replaced by Harry Truman, who wasn't quite as ego-massaging as Franklin Roosevelt was, which caused Stalin to have a real bad taste in his mouth about Truman and the fact that the U.S. had now successfully tested a nuclear bomb. And all of this set the stage for heightened global tensions. So as a result, we see a shifting balance of power. The devastation of World War II weakened European powers, while the U.S. economy boomed and the Soviet Union worked furiously to develop nuclear capabilities. We also see the breakdown of empires as calls for self-determination or an end to imperial rule increased. So the Cold War provided competing superpowers to support decolonization efforts, though often with strings or sometimes chains attached. World War II ends and the Cold War begins. There's no gap. Keep in mind that a Cold War means that they're not actively fighting each other. Oh, they fought on occasion, indirectly, of course, and there was competition in so many other areas. In 1946, Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister at this time of Great Britain, he traveled to America and made his famous Iron Curtain speech at the University of Missouri. Consider your audience and how that affected what he was talking about. He warned of Soviet expansion in Europe, in Eastern Europe specifically, and the Brits had a lot to be concerned about. They were much closer to the threat. So of course he wants Americans, especially young Americans, on their side. And thus, the perpetual metaphor of the Iron Curtain representing that boundary between democracy and communism begins. Out of his borderline propaganda came the U.S. policy of containment. Okay, propaganda. I mean, propaganda is meant to influence opinion, right? So it has a negative connotation, but everybody uses it. Everybody wants the other side to look bad or their side to look good. Everybody wants to persuade people to do something that will help them. So don't always think of it as negative. Just think of it as something that is trying to influence a group of people, sometimes for good and sometimes for bad. Anyway, out of this borderline propaganda came the U.S. policy of containment, announced in 1947 after the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, George Kennan, proposed the idea to President Truman of not going on the offensive, but basically stopping communism from spreading. Thus, the Truman Doctrine resulted in U.S. financial and military aid to Greece and Turkey. And the Marshall Plan meant a $12 billion commitment by the United States to rebuild Western Europe and prevent communism. Every game, every war, every competition needs its teams or sides. And in this Cold War, new-ish alliances emerged. The U.S. created NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, with Canada, Britain, France, and other European countries who were concerned about Soviet aggression. In response, when Germany was allowed to rearm and build up their army, the Soviets created the Warsaw Pact. One test of the containment policy occurred because the capital of East Germany was Berlin, which had also been divided into 4 zones of occupation. And that meant that NATO was smack dab in East Germany on the red side of the Iron Curtain. As a result, Stalin put a blockade in place to prevent supplies from entering West Berlin. He probably thought, half a city, nobody's going to fight to keep that. But that's exactly what happened. President Truman flew supplies in, well, not personally, but he had supplies flown in every day for months until the blockade was lifted. I mentioned before about fighting indirectly. When that happens, we call it a proxy war, fighting on behalf of someone else. The first occurred in Korea from 1950 to 1953. I'd love to get into the details, but basically the US, on behalf of the United Nations, supported South Korea, and the Soviets supported North Korea. The war ended in a stalemate, with the 38th parallel being the division between the two. A second proxy war happened in Vietnam from 1955 to 1975. Again, the U.S. fought to prevent communist expansion, but Vietnam reunified under communism. That was a total oversimplification of that. We'll save the rest of the story for both of those wars for another day, but do be sure to brush up on the details for your own knowledge. Last, the US and the Soviet Union competed through the arms race and the space race. The arms race was primarily the buildup of nuclear weapons. They both developed the hydrogen bombs and proceeded to stockpile nuclear weapons, short range, mid-range, long range. The Soviets had a great space program, and in 1957, they launched the first satellite into space called Sputnik, kicking off the space race, with America finally feeling victorious when they landed on the moon in 1969. All right, let's head on back with me to imperialism, empire building. One of the things that made the world wars was that most of the colonial holdings of the major participants in the war got involved in the fighting. All of that colonizing that happened, the age of imperialism, we're now about to undo almost all of it in a process called decolonization. Colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East sought independence from European rule. India began the process in the wars after helping Britain in World War I, then continuing to help in World War II. Finally, in 1947, what we call the partition of India and Pakistan and the British withdrawal from the region happened. Yay, right? Yes, but no. As violent conflict between Hindus and Muslims erupted as the two countries created in the partition beef with each other. If you were Hindu and you lived in Pakistan, well, you had to move and no one was happy about it. So there was fighting and killing and some continued conflict in the border regions, even up to today. The road to decolonization and independence was paved with challenges and sometimes people who emerged as leaders in the movement. In 1957, Ghana was the first African nation to gain independence from Britain, led by Kwame Nkrumah. I'm never good with these African names. Nakamura? Anyway, Algeria had a violent war against French rule in 1962. Vietnam War was mentioned before. It began with a struggle against French colonial rule led by Ho Chi Minh. And in a semi-complicated string of events, Egypt gained nominal independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1922, but Great Britain retained some rights in the region, being victors of World War I. In 1936, the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty gave more independence, but the British could keep troops to protect the Suez Canal. Post-World War II, Egypt and 5 other nations founded the Arab League, which eventually grew to 22 states. And Pan-Arabism was a movement that promoted cultural and political unity of Arab nations. They blended Islam and socialism and instituted reforms and nationalized some businesses. In the Suez Crisis, this was the result of the Suez Canal, which had been built by the Egyptians with French financing. It had been on loan to the French for 99 years and controlled by the British and the French. So Nasser, the president of Egypt, saw this as imperialism, and he took the Suez Canal. So Israel invaded Egypt at the behest of France and Great Britain, and they occupied the area around the canal and said they were acting under the United Nations. So the US and the Soviet Union opposed British and French actions and used the United Nations to broker peace. As a result, the foreign troops were removed, and the canal was put under the sovereignty of Egypt. But it became international waters and open to all traffic. You might be asking yourself, why did she just take the time to give all the deets with this? Well, there's a few implications here. First, the United Nations stationed peacekeeping troops there, pretty significant for that time. Second, Great Britain and France weren't happy with the United States interference. And last, the Suez Canal represents a nation remaining non-aligned, which means that they did not take sides with the 2 belligerents of the Cold War, neither the US or the Soviet Union. And we see that happen with a bunch of countries around this time period, where they're like, you know what? We're not picking sides. We're going to be non-aligned. Now, as the conflicts continue, we see resistance. 2 examples of challenges to Soviet power were the Hungarian uprising in 1956, which was crushed by Soviet tanks, and the second was Prague Spring in 1968, where Czechoslovakia attempted reforms but was stopped by the Soviet Union. Globally, there were resistance movements. I already mentioned the partition of India, but it's worth noting the leader of that resistance was Mohandas Gandhi, whose tactics consisted of non-violence and civil disobedience. Nelson Mandela led the anti-apartheid movement, fighting against racial segregation in South Africa. And in the United States, the civil rights movement, which lasted from 1954 to 1968, and the student protests, which were at their height in 1968, really just a year of global protest in the US, France, Japan, and Brazil. There was a moment before you, before me, that the world almost destroyed itself with nuclear weapons that it had developed. In 1961, the United States tried and failed to invade Cuba in an effort to remove Fidel Castro from power. This was known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, for no other reason than the bay where it happened was called the Bay of Pigs. But Castro was mad about this and sought solace from Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union. And one thing led to another, and the Americans discovered that the Cubans were allowing the Soviets to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Hadn't finished building them yet, but they were in the process. And this was just 90 minutes, 90 miles, depends on how fast you go, 90 miles from American soil. What transpired was a 13-day standoff before a peaceful resolution was reached. You will definitely get more details about this if you take APUSH or when you take American history, but it was a scary time for everyone, and it was the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. And then, just like that, it was over. Well, not really. I mean, even in AP World History, where we cover a lot, we oversimplify and gloss over many events. I'll just cover a few key events on the road to the end of the Cold War. In the 1970s, US President Richard Nixon and Soviet leader Brezhnev agreed to a détente, or easing of tensions, after the SALT talks, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, in which both sides agreed to limit some of the weapons that they were building. However, this would not last due to the Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989, where the USSR got bogged down in Afghanistan, draining their resources. And then, in the 1980s, US President Ronald Reagan and Soviet Premier Gorbachev became BFFs, not really. They became relatively friendly through a series of meetings with each other. I'd venture to guess that you've heard the famous line, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." That was part of a speech that Reagan made in 1987 in West Berlin. And so it took a few years. But they had been meeting, and Reagan knew that Gorbachev was making changes and was ready to hear that message. Those changes were mostly glasnost, policies that involved more openness by the Soviet government with the people, and perestroika, or economic restructuring, that involved reforms that introduced elements of market economics, a move away from communism. Kind of a big deal. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989, symbolizing the collapse of Soviet power in Eastern Europe. And in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, marking the official end of the Cold War. To summarize, 4 big takeaways from Unit 8. First, the Cold War shaped global politics for nearly 50 years through conflicts, alliances, and nuclear threats. Second, colonization movements reshaped world boundaries, creating new nations. Third, the US became the dominant world power after the Soviet Union's collapse. And last, or fourth, tensions from this period still influence modern global relations today. You know, one of the challenges of AP history classes is covering all of the content. Be sure to focus first on the illustrative examples. There will likely be questions about those specific things on the exam. And then pick a couple more historical examples that you can use in an essay to learn a little bit deeper about. Now, the next episode of the podcast will cover APUSH Unit 8, Cold War and Civil Rights, and that will come out on March 24th. Be sure to follow me or subscribe to my YouTube and or Spotify, because it helps me more than you know once I get enough subscribers. And I'm trying to meet you where you are. So TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, even Substack at AP History Help. And don't forget to enter to win a free copy of my Student Success Planner. That bit.ly link is above my head if you're watching this on video, or it is in the show notes, regardless of where you are watching this. All you got to do is give me your name, your email address, answer like 2 questions about where you listen to the podcast and what you listen to it on, and then hit submit. And I will pick one lucky winner on March 31st, and I will contact you to arrange delivery. And that's it. This episode of AP History Help is now history.